Imagine Alexey Kuznetsov, an experienced geographer and explorer, sets off into the taiga wilderness of Siberia to explore uncharted corners of nature. But what was supposed to be another expedition turns into a real nightmare when a storm and thick fog swallow his landmarks. Finding himself in the wilderness, Alexei loses touch with the world and with himself. His steps lead him further and further, but not to salvation, but to a mystery that is hidden in the heart of the forest. What is hidden in this Taiga Labyrinth? Why does everything that seems familiar turn out to be a trap? And who or what is watching him, playing with his mind and fate? Stay tuned to find out how this mysterious story ends. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more. Somewhere in the depths of Siberia, among the endless taiga expanses, there was a small village that not everyone could find on a map. Here, among cold winds and snowstorms, people lived in conditions in which every day was a struggle for survival. One of these people was Alexey Kuznetsov, a 35-year-old geographer and explorer. He devoted his entire life to studying the most remote corners of the planet, but this time was special. Alexey had just returned from a small expedition to the mountains, but it couldn't end that way. He was ready for new challenges and decided to go to the untouched taiga wilderness to study rare plants and unknown animals that weren't even mentioned in scientific sources. His plan was simple: walk through several trails in a week and return to the village. According to his calculations, this time should be enough to study a fairly large area. He was an experienced tourist, and he knew that this time he wouldn't need satellite communication or help from other people. On October 22nd, Alexei set out on his journey. The weather was cold, but not too harsh for the time of year. He followed old forest paths trodden by previous explorers. But on this day, something went wrong. The wind suddenly picked up, and an unusually strong storm swept through the forest. The sky became overcast, snow began to fall, and the bright day was immediately swallowed by darkness. Alexei wasn't surprised. He knew that in places like this, the weather could change in a couple of hours. But something was wrong with this storm. The wind seemed to be blowing away all landmarks, and soon Alexei realized that he had lost his way. The path he should have covered in a couple of hours suddenly became impassable. Night was falling fast. He decided to stop and make camp for the night. After pitching his tent, Alexei felt that he had not chosen the right place to camp. The wind continued to howl in the trees, as if carrying his thoughts into the fog. Alexei pulled out a map and tried to find the location, but the storm did not allow him to concentrate. There was no satellite reception, and Alexei realized that the heightened sense of anxiety was not accidental. He tried not to think that perhaps there hadn't been a storm of this magnitude in the region for years. The weather was getting worse with each passing hour. It seemed as if nature itself was protesting his presence. But he was a geographer, and there was always room in his mind for a scientific explanation. These phenomena couldn't be inexplicable, even if they seemed a little strange. All he could do was wait out the storm Everything was going well until Alexey noticed that his tent was shifting. The wind was so strong that its corners were lifting off the ground, and the tent was shifting. He stepped outside, but immediately felt that something was wrong with this place. The fog was thickening and seemed to be trying to envelop him, to swallow him whole. Alexey stood completely alone, without any connection to the world, in the middle of the taiga wasteland, becoming more and more vulnerable with each passing hour. His last entry in his diary was vague and unclear. "It is impossible to understand where I am. The wind and fog hide everything. I made a mistake with the landmarks. But I will continue. Everything will be fine." In his head, there was still a spark of confidence that these were only minor difficulties. However, the deep inner fear that he could usually suppress did not leave him. He didn't know that the storm that raged around him was only the beginning of what he would have to endure in this taiga hell. Time was losing its meaning, and the path that seemed so familiar to him was now a deception that he could not overcome. When the storm died down, Alexey decided to move on. But after taking a few steps, he realized that he couldn't find his trail. Everything seemed so familiar, but at the same time alien. Suddenly, something changed. The fog, which had seemed thick and scary just a few hours ago, now covered the ground like a bottomless ocean in which all his landmarks disappeared. Alexey tried to return to the camp, but realized that he could not find either the tent or the backpack. He was lost. There was only one question left: how to get out of this place where all landmarks had disappeared and nature seemed alive and hostile. Alexey moved, trying to make his way through the snow and fog, but with every step, his confidence slipped away. It was as if time had ceased to have meaning, and every minute was subject only to the cruel wind that constantly beat in his face. The fog, which he had noticed from the very beginning of his night stop, was becoming thicker and the cold more piercing. He stopped several times to try to find some trace of his previous path, but all around was lifeless emptiness. The snow he had left behind had long since been covered by a new layer, so that there was no trace of his tracks left on the ground. It was strange. Even if he had lost his way, he should have left some traces. But here, everything was as if he had not been there. Everything was covered in emptiness. After a while, Alexey noticed that his breathing had become heavy and his legs had begun to fail. He had not felt his arms and legs for a long time, and the fingers that clutched the map were almost no longer obeying him. Nature was becoming not just a difficult obstacle for him, but a real wall that he could not break through. Without satellite communications and a map, without a reliable source of heat, he found himself on the brink of survival. "I can't give up," he thought, although he himself didn't know what prompted this thought. Perhaps it was fear, or perhaps habit. He continued moving forward, hoping to at least find traces of those people who might have passed this route before. Memories of winter hikes floated into his mind when, despite everything, he always knew where he was and knew that his paths would lead him where he needed to go. But now, in this empty wasteland, there was no map, no path. He was completely dependent on his will and physical strength. At some point, even they began to fail him. After a few hours, when the fatigue became almost insurmountable, Alexey noticed strange signs in the snow, small cracks, strange tracks that could look like animals. But it was strange. The snow around did not have tracks of large animals. These tracks were left by some small creatures moving quickly. Alexey did not know what kind of animals these were, but decided to follow them, hoping that this would lead him to some kind of landmark. Following these small footprints, Alexey soon found himself near a cliff. This was the last place he could reach. To the right was a forest. To the left was a gorge filled with snow and ice. He felt that if he lingered any longer, he simply would not be able to move on. There was no sign of trouble, but at that very moment, a new storm began. It came from the north, with a new wave of wind and snow, as if nature itself had decided to survive him to the end. The wind became so strong that it was impossible to breathe without sucking cold air into the lungs. Alexey tried to find shelter, but when he turned around, he realized that his tracks had disappeared. He couldn't have been in this place for long. Everything around was covered in snow, and there was not a single track, no backpack, no stick with which he could navigate. Desperately, he looked at the map again and tried to focus, but the fog was so thick that he couldn't even make out the names of the nearby places. Having made a decision, he tried to move forward, although he didn't know where this path led. He thought that if he kept going, he would at least get to an area where he could be found, but time and strength were slipping away. Meanwhile, in the village where Alexey had left, people were getting worried. His family and colleagues had not received a single message from him since his last report. No one knew what had happened to the explorer, and a search was only organized several days later, when the locals had already begun to realize that something was wrong. The situation was becoming more desperate with each passing hour. Authorities had already begun planning a search operation, but heavy snowfalls and worsening conditions made it clear that they would need the help of specialists. Alexey, somewhere in the heart of this natural hell, could not have imagined that his search would become such a crucial moment in the fight for survival. At that moment, when Alexey stood on the edge of the cliff, on the verge of giving up, he heard a noise that seemed to come from somewhere far away. He listened and realized that it was not the wind. It was the sound of a helicopter. A new hope appeared in his mind, but only for a moment. The storm was so strong that the helicopter would hardly be able to break through such elements. However, Alexey decided that this was his only option. He began to move towards the sound, despite all his fatigue and anxiety. The noise was getting closer and closer, and Alexey continued to walk, not knowing how long he would have to fight this element. Alexey walked towards the sound, despite his fatigue and the ever-increasing obstacles. Every movement was painful. Every breath was heavy. The storm had become even stronger. and the snow did not stop. The wind blew with renewed force, as if trying to push him back. Nevertheless, the thought of the helicopter, which was probably close, the sound became clearer and clearer, and Alexey realized that he couldn't be mistaken. He listened to the noise again, and now he was sure that it was a helicopter. But with every step, his hope grew dimmer. The snow became so thick that he could barely see in front of him, and with each new gust of wind, it seemed that he was losing his last strength. He didn't know how much time had passed since he decided to follow that sound. But the sense of time had gone into the void. He no longer knew where he was. Suddenly, Alexey felt his legs give way beneath him. He lost his balance and fell into the deep snow, feeling the icy moisture penetrate his clothes, instantly freezing him. The wind suddenly picked up, and for a few seconds, he felt as if he couldn't even stand up. Every time he tried to get up, his body would sag, as if it would no longer obey. At some point, it began to seem like this was the end. He lay in the snow, barely able to breathe, feeling the cold seep into his bones, his eyes closing from exhaustion. This can't be it, he thought, trying to fight the growing sense of doom. But suddenly, amidst the ever-increasing roar of the wind, he heard that sound again, faint, barely perceptible, but still there. It was the helicopter, its propellers cutting through the air, the sound growing louder. Alexey forced himself to stand, although every cell in his body screamed at the impossibility of continuing. He took a few steps forward, clinging to the nearest trees and rocks. But as soon as he stopped moving, he felt his strength fading again. At that moment, something changed. A light appeared from beyond the horizon, breaking through the fog and snow. At first, it was faint, then brighter and brighter. Alexey began to move faster, realizing that his salvation was now so close. The light was getting closer, and some incredible relief appeared in his chest. Finally, when the light became unbearably bright, Alexey heard a voice. It was unclear, as if it was being spoken through a thick barrier, but it was there. He tried to answer, but no sound came out of his throat, only muffled coughs. At that moment, his body could no longer resist. He fell into the snow, unable to keep himself on his feet. But the light didn't disappear. It kept moving forward, as if it were coming to him. And then a hand touched him. A strong, reliable hand that caught him and lifted him up. Before Alexey could understand anything, his body began to sway, and the air around him was filled with sounds that were so familiar. He was in a rescue helicopter. At first, it seemed to him that he heard nothing, only a roar in his ears and echoes of the storm. He tried to open his eyes, but they were heavy. However, the helicopter slowly gained altitude, and with each meter, he felt how the nightmare he had been in just a few minutes ago was leaving him. "You're alive, Alexey," said a voice nearby. It was one of the pilots. He looked tired, but his voice was calm. Alexey tried to smile, but his body was still paralyzed with fatigue. He listened as the pilot described the search operation, how they found him by following tracks left in the snow. The search was difficult because of the storm, and for a long time they could not find his tracks. But eventually, technology allowed them to find his location. But it wasn't just relief. Once in the helicopter, Alexey realized that the storm wasn't over yet, and the question of how he ended up in this situation haunted him. He realized that he might not have survived on his own, that this situation was much more serious than just a researcher who had lost his way. He tried to focus and remember what exactly had happened, but his thoughts were jumbled. All he could think was that he was alive. Everything else was beyond his comprehension. Soon, he fell into a doze, forgetting about the pain and fatigue, about the worries, and how he could have ended up so far from safety. All he felt at that moment was the feeling that he had survived, and what would happen next. He did not yet know. When Alexey came to, the drone of the helicopter was still in his head. He tried to open his eyes, but everything around him was blurry. A strange heaviness in his body did not go away, and every breath was like a struggle. He felt his body slowly recovering, but his strength was returning very slowly. His entire right arm was numb, and his left arm was barely able to rise. Thoughts flashed through his head that all this might just be a nightmare, and he would soon wake up in his camp. But as soon as he tried to get up, reality came with renewed vigor. The helicopter seemed to be no longer flying so fast. It had landed somewhere safe, sheltered from the storm, in the place where Alexey had hoped to find salvation. But something inside him was nagging at him. He could not shake off the feeling that this storm was no accident, that this whole trek, his loss and disappearance, could not have been so simple. When the helicopter finally touched down, he was led out of the cockpit, and for a moment he felt solid ground beneath his feet. There was a group of rescuers around him, their voices weak, but there was more in their eyes than just relief at finding him. They looked at him as if he had miraculously survived. "You're safe," one of the rescuers said. "We found you, Alexey. You survived. Everything will be fine." But Alexey couldn't stop. He asked himself the same questions. Why was he there in the wasteland? Why did he lose his bearings? Why couldn't he find his way back when everything seemed so familiar? There were no answers. His thoughts haunted him, and this strange emptiness in his soul did not go away. Hours later, he was taken to base camp, where he received medical attention. He couldn't believe that only a few days ago he had been on the verge of death. But now that he was relatively safe, his thoughts were sharpened, and he could find no peace. Meanwhile, the search party working to rescue him continued to figure out what had happened, trying to piece together the sequence of events. They studied his route, looking for clues to understand why he had gotten so lost. With each passing day, it became clearer that Alexey's miscalculation and loss of bearings were part of something much bigger. "You couldn't just get lost like that," one of the officers said as they discussed the situation in the camp. "You're an experienced traveler. You wouldn't make such a mistake. Something's wrong." Alexey was silent, considering these words. He couldn't explain what exactly had gone wrong, and that was what worried him most. All this time, while he was in the wasteland, he felt like something invisible was watching him, as if nature itself was playing cat and mouse with him. But that would not explain the lost way. He couldn't shake the feeling that his journey had become something more dangerous than just a natural storm. Rescuers and officers continued to investigate while Alexey recovered. Meanwhile, he also began to realize that many of his personal belongings had disappeared the moment he lost his way. His backpack was empty, his tent was found in a different location, and several of his items, such as his compass and map, seemed to have been snatched away by something unknown. Only after a few days, when Alexey's physical condition returned to normal, he decided it was time to return home. But this return was no longer as easy as before. Every step in the camp, every glance at the map, reminded him of something important that he could not forget. The officers suggested he return to civilization, where his family was waiting for him. They argued that staying there would be taking unnecessary risks. But Alexey had other ideas. He wanted to figure out what had really happened. He couldn't just forget how his things had disappeared, why he had lost his way, and why it had taken so long to find him. "This is not just a mistake," he said, turning to the officers. "This was not just a storm. This was not just a glitch. There is something more to this, and I am going to find out what it is." Then, realizing that his decision would not be popular, he began planning a new journey. This time, he would take a different route, using methods he had not yet tried. He knew he had to find answers, and even if nature and its inexplicable wonders were against him, he was not going to give up. The next morning, Alexey left the camp, but he was left with the feeling that his fight had only just begun. All those doubts that tormented him would not disappear until he found the truth. There were only questions in his head, and the answers did not come. Returning home was not what Alexey expected. Everything he had experienced in the forest did not let him go. Every step in a familiar environment, every look at the world now seemed alien and distorted. The helicopter, the camp, the rescue, all this was like a bright spot against the foggy reality that did not leave him alone. He tried to regain his strength, but the memories did not allow him to forget what happened in those mountain expanses. For the rest of the time he was in the village, Alexey could not shake the feeling that he had not been told the whole truth. He could not understand why they had found him so quickly, although he was absolutely sure that he had lost all traces. Why did the rescuers find him in such a short period of time? If he himself had wandered through the forest for several days, losing all orientation, as soon as his physical condition returned to normal, Alexey decided to return. He could no longer leave this matter unresolved. There was no doubt in his mind. His mistake, the loss of the route, and the strange circumstances of the hike could not have been accidental. This time he no longer expected support. He bought new equipment and armed himself with the necessary maps and materials. All that was left for him was to return to the places where he was rescued and try to figure out what had happened. Maybe there was some answer hidden in the depths of that taiga wasteland. All he knew was that the remaining questions were much more important than his personal safety. This time, his path was different. Alexey no longer tried to follow the dark sky, the thick snow, and the low temperature immediately reminded him that he was not ready for this journey. But it no longer scared him. He walked without thinking. With each step, he felt more and more that he was returning to the moment when it all began. But now, everything was different. Several days passed before he found himself in the place where he had been rescued. He checked the area carefully, examining every corner and every trace. But as before, there were no traces. Everything was exactly the same as on the day of his disappearance. The branch on which he could have left his marks was still there. But if someone had passed this way, there should have been traces. Why were there none? The feeling that something was wrong was growing in his mind. Everything he had experienced seemed impossible. He couldn't believe that his path had been erased so easily, and the further he went, the more he felt that this forest was hiding something important from him. He soon found a small clearing with nothing of note, just empty trees and deep snow. He crouched down to look around when his gaze suddenly caught on something strange. A partially snow-covered object, barely visible among the trees. It was his backpack. Alexey hurried over. He couldn't believe his eyes. It was his backpack, the one that had disappeared when they found him. But how did it end up here, in this place, when he couldn't get to it himself? He opened it, and inside were all his things. Maps, a compass, even a thermos with the remains of his tea. His hands began to shake as he realized he couldn't explain what was happening. How was this possible? Why was the backpack that was in his camp here? Someone had to have taken it and left it. But who? And why didn't he remember leaving the backpack here? The memory problems, the strange circumstances of the hike, the disappearance of tracks. All this raised more and more questions. Alexey no longer doubted that his path had been manipulated in some way. Something was clearly wrong here, and he had to find out what exactly. Leaving the clearing, he decided to move on. He couldn't stop. The further he went, the clearer his goal became. To figure out what was happening in these woods, to understand what was behind his loss of bearings and the disappearance of tracks. He knew that he could find the answer if he kept moving. Meanwhile, in the village where he was rescued, everyone noticed that Alexey had become a different person. He was no longer the explorer who dealt with difficulties with ease. His eyes were shining with determination, and he set off into the forest again, despite warnings. "Do you know that you may not come back?" one of his friends asked him. "I can't stop," Alexey replied, looking into his interlocutor's eyes. "I need to understand what happened, and I won't give up until I find the answer." Alexey continued his journey deeper into the forest, despite warnings from locals and friends. He increasingly felt that his presence in these places was not just an accident, but part of something much more complex and hidden. With each step, he became more and more convinced that his disappearance and subsequent rescue were only part of a larger plan that he needed to uncover. He walked through the forest, choosing his steps carefully, avoiding the more dangerous areas that were familiar from his previous routes. Every now and then, He stopped to examine his tracks, but everything was as empty and lifeless as the day he was found. There were no traces of his previous path, no marks that he could have left. It was as if the entire forest had swallowed up his past. The weather remained cold, and the snow slowly covering the ground reminded him that he didn't have much time. He knew that the storm could return again, and if he didn't figure out what was happening, he could end up in an even more dangerous situation than before. Alexey moved forward resolutely, not stopping for a moment. A few days later, when he had almost reached the place where the tracks had lost him, something strange happened. He heard footsteps. They were faint, but clear. Someone was moving next to him. It was not the wind, not a random sound. He turned around, but there was no one in the forest. Too strange. He felt the tension growing, and his heart began to beat faster. The feeling that someone was watching him became indescribable. He tried to calm down and continue on his way, but the fear did not leave him. Suddenly, he noticed something that immediately caught his attention. Among the trees, slightly off the path, he noticed tracks that clearly did not belong to him. They were human tracks, but they looked unusual, unnaturally deep, with sharp edges as if left by some heavy equipment or clothing. He came closer and realized that the tracks went off to the side, leading into a denser forest. The feeling of alarm increased, but Alexey could not turn back. He decided to follow them. After spending several more hours searching, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching his every move. Even if he couldn't see these people, even if he couldn't feel their presence, everything in the forest was against him. He didn't know what exactly could be moving behind him, but he knew inside that this time it was more than just a coincidence. After walking a little further, he came across tracks that led him to the place where he had already been. He couldn't understand how it was possible, but this part of the forest was familiar to him. He was standing in the same place where he had been rescued, and there were no traces of his own path, no tent, no backpack, no items he had left behind. All that was left was emptiness. Night was falling fast. The fog that had gathered among the trees hid everything around him. Alexey realized that he couldn't stay here. He had to go, although he didn't know where. He was beginning to feel that this forest wasn't just empty. It was alive, but there was something dangerous about it, something that held him back, forcing him to move in a circle with no way out. He heard the footsteps again, closer now. It was not the sound of the wind or the sounds of wild animals. He turned again, but this time he saw nothing. He stood looking into the dark trees, which his eyes could not penetrate. Each step forward was a step into emptiness. He had no strength for anything else but to walk. Almost by inertia, Alexey chose the way back. Step by step, he moved back in the direction he had come from, but the forest became more and more familiar. He felt that he was returning to the place he had already passed once, but he did not know how this was possible. So, by sunset, Alexey found himself in the same clearing where he had first found the backpack. Everything was the same as that time. He stood there, not believing his eyes, but the reality was so strange that everything seemed like an illusion. He sat down to catch his breath when he noticed something strange in the snow. Among the drifts, he saw something that couldn't be a coincidence. The same footprints he had left seemingly hours ago. His own footprints. But how was that possible? Why were they there if he hadn't come this way? Then Alexey understood. He hadn't just returned to the beginning. He had found himself in a vicious circle in which everything was repeated. These tracks, this clearing, this place, everything was part of something that was beyond his understanding. He was back where it all began, but now he had a new question. What had really happened to him in that forest? Why was it all happening again, and he couldn't get out? He didn't know how much time had passed. And yet, despite all the fears and worries, he knew one thing. He needed to find a way out. Out of this forest, out of this nightmare that led him to the same place again and again. He stood up and took a step forward into the unknown. Alexey didn't know how much time had passed since he had found himself back in the clearing. Whether it had been a few minutes or a few days, everything was mixed up in his mind. He tried to remember how it was possible that he had ended up here again. He stood looking at his tracks that led to nowhere, and he felt the fog swallowing everything around him, as if nature itself was squeezing him in its embrace. Every step he took seemed to bring him back to the very moment where he had started his journey. The feeling of an endless, vicious circle grew stronger, and although his mind tried to find an explanation for what was happening, Alexey intuitively felt that his trip was not a coincidence. Everything he had experienced, everything that was happening in these woods seemed to be part of something bigger, something that he could not understand, and that continued to lead him to the same point. He remembered his last journal entry, which now seemed strangely prophetic. Today will be my last day. I will not survive this storm here. But was that just his fear, his vision, or something more real? He didn't know, and that was what scared him most. Night had already fallen, but its coming seemed inevitable, part of something that was not dependent on time. Alexey tried to calm down, although he knew it was pointless. There was not a single sound in the depths of the forest, only a dead silence, as if the whole world had frozen, watching him. He continued walking, hoping to find some way out of this strange, enclosed space. His feet were walking on the same snow, on the same tracks he had just left, but which were already disappearing as soon as he looked away. Everything around him was a deception. These tracks, this space, these trees, as if he was trapped in a trap that nature itself had set for him. But when he looked back again, his gaze fell on one of the trees. There, on the trunk, he saw something familiar, and it was something he had seen before. They were his own marks, marks he had once made to orient himself. There were only a few of them, but they were clearly his. He walked closer, and his heart began to pound as he realized that these marks did not lead to his camp, but in an entirely different direction. Not believing his eyes, several hours passed before Alexey came across something strange. He stopped, listening to the forest, and then his gaze fell on a strange shadow in the distance. At first, he thought it was a tree, but then he realized that it couldn't be a tree. It was a figure, the figure of a man. His breath caught in his throat, but he forced himself not to move. He didn't know who it could be, and he didn't even know what to do. The figure stood there, and Alexey couldn't tell if it was real or just a trick of light and shadow. He took another step, trying to get closer, but at that moment the figure disappeared. It dissolved into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. Alexey stood there, not understanding what had happened. His heart was pounding wildly, but he understood that now he had no choice but to move on. He didn't know who or what could be in this forest. All his theories, all his thoughts about disappearances and strange events lost their meaning when he came face to face with this forest. All he could do was follow his intuition without looking back. Step by step, he moved forward, and soon his gaze fell upon a familiar clearing again. It was the same clearing where he had seen the backpack. But now everything was different. New tracks had appeared in the snow, and they led in a direction he had not yet explored. Alexey realized that this was a new path. Perhaps this was the only path left to him. He took another step in that direction, not doubting that he was close to solving the mystery. The next morning, when his search reached a new peak and he finally stopped to rest, Alexey realized that everything that had happened to him was not an accident. Everything he had experienced was part of his journey, and perhaps now he was ready to find out what this forest really hides, what answers he might find, and what the real reasons for his disappearance were. But despite all the questions that remained unanswered, he still didn't know what lay ahead. The only thing that was clear to him was that the journey would not end until he solved this riddle. Alexey knew that he had to move forward, despite everything that was left behind. Alexey stood at the edge of the forest, where the snow had become less dense and the trees were more sparse, revealing a space he did not know. His body, tired from long hours of searching, still continued to move forward, but his thoughts were clouded. He did not know what awaited him next. All he could do was keep going, as he always did, despite the fear, despite the fatigue. The answers he had sought for so long remained out of reach. With every step he took through this new, almost empty terrain, his inner tension only increased. He felt like he was moving closer to something important, but at the same time, something inside him told him that this road would not lead to relief. He tried to tune in, to concentrate, but he could not shake off the feeling of inevitability. Every step he took echoed in this world full of emptiness. He stopped on a small hill, overlooking a wide view of a forest that seemed to go on and on. The weather was still harsh, but the fog was finally beginning to clear. Alexey stood and looked out at the world he had once known, but which now seemed alien. All his attempts to understand what was happening were in vain. The answers he sought did not come, or if they did, they only raised more questions. Suddenly, his gaze fell on something familiar. It was a mark left on the tree bark, just like the ones he had made before. Alexey came closer and, looking closer, realized that this mark was not made by him. It was much rougher and deeper, as if left by someone else who could have been here before him. He knew that it could have been one of those who had followed him in this forest. Alexey's heart began to pound. He took a few steps forward to survey the surrounding area, and then his gaze fell upon the tracks again. They were fresh tracks, leading deeper into the forest, and they were as strange as all the ones he had seen before. Human tracks, but somehow irregular, not going quite straight, getting lost in the snow. He followed them, and with every step, his anxiety grew. The tracks led him deeper into the forest, but Alexey felt that they would not lead him where he hoped. He kept walking, although his mind protested. He could not stop, although he knew that none of this made sense. The forest seemed alive, and each step he took in this place was a step into emptiness, into a strange labyrinth that did not want to let him out. When he found himself back in the clearing, everything was the same. The same trees, the same snow, the same fog. He couldn't believe what was happening. These places, which had once seemed so familiar to him, were now completely alien. He tried to remember where exactly he had been before, but everything was mixed up in his mind, and he couldn't separate one moment from another. At that moment, he realized that he would never get out of here. This wasn't just a forest. This was his own labyrinth, created by his mind, his fear, his search. He was trapped. And even though he was still standing here, looking for a way out, he didn't really know where to go. The cold wind hit him in the face again, and he closed his eyes, feeling the fog filling his thoughts. He no longer knew what he was looking for. All he knew was that the answers would not come until he let go. He couldn't keep searching because he knew he was looking for something that couldn't be found. He looked back again, and despite his determination, he realized that he had come to this place not for answers, but to understand one thing. Sometimes you don't need to search to find. Sometimes you just need to let go and accept that many questions remain unanswered. Alexey stood in the fog, looking at the tracks that led into the empty, lifeless distance. He knew that he would not find a way out, but both he and the forest had become part of this space, and no matter how hard he tried, he could not change what had happened. In the silence of the forest, in the midst of the winter cold, he finally accepted that his journey was over. Alexey's story has come to an end, but it would not have happened without this strange journey that forever changed his view of the world. The questions remain, but the answers have disappeared into the fog, hiding in the heart of the forest.